therapy and astrology is a place to call whole. Wholeness is where you take your testing times to be initiations and life diplomas, and where you realize how to intervene for yourself in a loving way. Welcome to Therapeutic Astrology Podcast, or in short, TAP. Welcome back to TAP. I am going to start to use that abbreviation because it's such my own genius idea, and it's just much easier to pronounce. So TAP from now on. Welcome to TAP. How are you doing? I'm excited to spend some time with you here. We'll be talking about dissociation, which is mentally separating from the body, even separating from the sense of self, because of intolerable feelings, at least at one point, a very early point usually in our lives. So dissociation is much similar to what we call trauma. It's the direct effect of a trauma, and it will impede upon one's development. So the capacity to self-regulate, the capacity to have authentic relationships. And I was just thinking about an example of my dissociation, my dissociated past, because I have lived many years with that dissociative quality in one context or another. And this one is really about how I used to live only in the world of ideas, existentialism, the philosophy that especially the religion that I was brought up in gave. And I just have this memory I wanted to share, that I had just given birth to my first child. It's a big one. I was 22 and we had just moved cities. And I was having a meeting with this new minister. He was not new, but we were new to the city, so we were new to the church. And I remember this because, we tend to remember when we get emotional, right? I really got emotional here. I held my little baby, and I guess I put him in the baby carriage, and then I spoke to this minister. And what I said is, I'm so much in despair. I'm so desperate to help people in the third world. I mean, you would think that I was going to say something about the baby, right? But I was really pleading for that we should do more to help people who don't have food, who don't have shelter, who's like sick and lost. We need to help people. And insofar, that's a good, I guess, right? That seems like a person who's good-hearted to care about other people, right? You have empathy. And what the minister did was answering exactly what I said. Like, we're doing actually a few things in Africa, and he talked to me about the programs that they were supporting and that we could donate money to it. And we spoke about how I couldn't right now travel to another country. I did have that realization. I was realistic around that. But I could be volunteer in the church. And then I signed up for different volunteer commitments, which is a big part of at least being religious in the way that I was, is being volunteering. And so that's the end of what actually happened. But when I think back now, that I was so, and it didn't totally help, being a volunteer is just you doing a little bit. What I was really feeling into was the helplessness, the powerlessness of not being able to save the world. So it was like childhood trauma meets ideation of some sorts, like huge ideals, and then not only that, like a lot of religious views played into that, and gonna do a chapter on compassion at some point, and you'll hear more about what I mean with that, because that's that can also be actually misunderstood, maybe even carried out when you're not quite developed for it. I'm talking about compassion here in quotations. So yeah, I just think that that's actually a little example of dissociation, because my head and my heart was with all of these other people I haven't met, and again, that's good to be aware, what's going on around the world. It's good to empathize. It's good to help. But look at this. I'm 22. I had my first baby. I don't even care about your age if it's your first baby. You've just had a baby, okay? I mean, he was, I think, 1 or 2 months old at the time. And here I am with a minister, and I'm crying. I remember I was crying for people so far away from me, and for that feeling of being helpless. To me today, I would not trust my words. I would consider this is some sort of, this is maybe where it blends a little bit, dissociation, maybe also like a projection. But at least the dissociation part that we'll be speaking about today is the fact that my head was somewhere else, even though my baby was right there. Like my baby, what is that situation requiring of me? To be present, to be there with my baby, and my default emotions, if you can call it that, my automatic way of being in the world was going into philosophy, going into existentialism, going into how can I save people on a larger scale. That's a default. Not questioning that that's not good for anything at all. But I am questioning that that's not probably the ones you should get right here when you have a little baby who needs you to be present. So what was new for me, what was not automatic, was the bonding, was the being present, was the being embodied in myself so that I could regulate this baby too. Yeah. So I just came to think of that, and I hope that as we progress in this chapter of on dissociation, I hope that you'll remember things too, and just consider, is that a dissociation or not, and maybe it really doesn't matter, because I'm sure that you'll remember, you'll associate to it for a reason. And from what I've read on the topic, people have really different views on this. Some are like dissociation, it's just you're speaking about it too randomly. It's reserved for only categories like DID, where you completely can't remember what you've done when you were dissociated. And others is completely in the other end of the scale, talking about if you can't remember what you ate for breakfast, then you're dissociated, right? So it varies how people use the word. I think that today, just to get a sense of what it is, I think we're just going to open it up and make it pretty broad. Let's see. First, I wanted to recap a little bit about what we were talking about in the last episode. So if it's all a blur to you, you didn't go through that one yet, and I want it to be absolutely possible for you to hear each chapter independently, which means I will circle around issues, repeating stuff, saying the same things but slightly different, because these are all topics that I care a lot about, so they circle around in my mind. So don't think that you have to listen to everything. It's gonna come around again. And now that we're just getting started, I thought maybe to just take up a little bit about what was spoken of the last time. And I want to underscore that no chapter is ever gonna exhaust any topic, okay? So you can really join anywhere, and we'll talk more into everything. So we were talking about how to define a trauma, and trauma is synonymous with wound, But it's not only the moment of outside-in abuse, that wounding, the neglect, the misattunement, the violence. There's also the internal unconscious response to that trauma. It's what we call traumatic adaptation. The unconscious response could be a self-attack, or is usually a self-attack in some constellation. And we looked at this feeling of being less than, not enough, not okay, wrong. That really creates such a separation from others. And I hope that it's clear to you that there is nothing wrong with you. And even if you have done harm to others, we all have to live with that. We have done harm to others and we regret it. Then your essence, a deeper aspect of being, there is a deeper aspect of you that has not been touched by trauma or adapted to it, that is seeking goodness, seeking what is right, seeking healing. So it's a feeling of being wrong, and it's absolutely not about you. It's about the environment that you grew up in. And then we spoke of how Pluto from astrology, represents the trauma that lie in the earlier, less accessible layers of awareness. That is even around the tone in the womb. The tone in the womb and in the childhood home, which reminds me of this Jung quote that you've probably heard before, that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents. I mean, I could quote it in different contexts than this one, but I think that tone in the childhood home, at least for me, that makes me think of all that unlived life, all that the parents didn't deal with and therefore did not fulfill in their life. So when parents are in distress or carrying traumas themselves, the child will absorb it, and of course are also likely to not be tolerated and attached to, as well as if the parents were in contact with themselves and their aliveness. And this brings danger. You are not safe fundamentally. It's easier for a child to identify with being bad than experiencing the danger actually coming from an unsafe environment. So unsafe caregivers, parents. So this is where it becomes a very early self-understanding of being broken, or something to the effect of wrong, bad. And then Plutonian experiences as adult build on early traumas of not feeling welcomed as you are. Betrayals, death, failures, contact with crime. This reinforces the fearful state of personality, and that's why sometimes when we speak about Pluto, we're really speaking about the dark shadow material. So when there are Plutonian transits, I'm talking about now the current time, like when Pluto is affecting, stimulating a certain place in your chart, all the repressed material, the hunger cannot be held out of consciousness, and we come to act out or act in what was done or what was not done. I mean, what was neglected to have happened to us. So it's tricky because early trauma is non-verbal and therefore encoded in the body, and it's non-verbal, so you can't speak it. And often when we talk about these things in therapy, we can get curious what actually did happen, but it's just in there, and you can't ever really know. Most of us, I think. So, but the important thing here is that the turning point here is that we can make different choices. If we don't make different choices, then we're gonna stay in that darker side of Pluto. And I mean, a different choice doesn't have to be like you're just rising from the mud all on your own. That's probably not gonna happen in any healthy way. Another choice is to, for example, to ask for help with all these unpleasant memories and emotions, so that you get the support to do the inner work rather than numbing it, because that will lead to repetitions of hurt, which is also the archetype of Pluto, that it just carries on from one generation to the next. And then Pluto also represents the transformation. This is what I love in astrology, that there's so many layers to it, and what is the negative side can be turned around, and then it's actually the high road, the positive side. So Pluto also represents the transformation, where you exchange something with someone, and what you got stays with you in a permanent way. So it's this continuity of growth with Pluto. And what it is that you want to exchange with the other person, what it is that you want to merge with and have to stay with you, really depends on, we can call it your value system. We can also call it the development of your heart. Because maybe in the beginning you just want to survive. So for example, with partners, you maybe just want to be with someone where it's just like safe, and you just this practical, like something that just makes you feel like, this is just okay. Now I'm good. And then later on, as you develop your heart, to use that phrase, then you start to see that it actually also matters what partner it is, and what kind of fellowship you have together, what kind of friendship, what kind of intimacy you have together. So that's when you're ready for more than just pure survival. So if you are Scorpio, or you have a Scorpion signature, it's really important to take in consideration all of your chart, right? Then there is dramatic changes in life, and second chapters like that. You get a new lease on life. So for all of us, because Scorpio is in all of us somewhere, it's about growing into more of what our souls desire. And the interesting thing here, I think, is you might merge with something on the basis of identifying as bad. So the whole merging idea, maybe I should mention what I mean about that, but it's a Pluto effect. It's where you fuse with something because you are in it to grow, right? You're here to grow. So you absorb this in, and then you become more powerful, and you become, better in your life. But what if you identify as being bad, and then what you take in is a match for that, because of this deep-seated adaptation? As children, if we were not supported to connect to our real self, this is what can happen. So as children, if we were not supported to connect to our real selves, then it becomes a deep held identification that we should not connect to our real selves, that it is threatening, that it's dangerous to do that. But that's how it was for us when we were young children. And when we are still using that to protect us from something that was at the time too overwhelming to connect to, then we are blocking ourselves from the lives that we potentially could live now, in the present, with a newborn, with anything in us and around us. So I'm also thinking about if you feel validated when diagnosed, or when someone points out what could be wrong with you. It's interesting, and it's not one-dimensional. it's not one-dimensional. So I'm just going to say one part to something that has many pieces to it here. But could it be because when you feel validated, right? Oh, I have this diagnosis. That is why I am so fucked up. When I'm so messed up, or whatever you would feel about yourself. Is it because the defect you feel inside is now accepted? We all agree something is wrong with you. And that feels good to get that kind of confirmation. That you are in fact standing apart from others because that is how you feel. So it's kind of nice to have that accepted. See, just where I find archetypal structures to be so important is right here. Because if we're going to understand the cure and the cause to whatever potential diagnosis or explanation, whatever that is describing, the birth chart can really remind us that whatever we're struggling with, it's not because of a mistake or a defect. And certainly you're not a defected and your life is not a mistake. I used to think so, honestly, for so many years. Absolutely feeling my father didn't want me. I can't figure out the social stuff and I keep disappointing everyone. I'm at my core a mistake, I would think. And because of these old demons of self-splitting experiences, I now truly believe that wounds can be overcome because I feel that has healed in me, that has shifted in me. And of course, I want to say this. Hopefully, I'm going to say it again. But otherwise, if I don't, this is really important. I hope I'm going to say it again. Of course, that there are moments where old patterns are going to come up, right? Who are we kidding? Of course, old patterns are going to come up. But you're going to tackle it differently once you know this at a very deep level and with more of you than just in your head. Know it. Like when your body knows that you are actually totally great on the inside and you're not bad. Then when it pops up, it's just easier to say, okay, I hear that this is what protected me at a certain time in my life because I couldn't connect to what was real. And I had to think that I was bad because that is what I was told or whatever. And thank you for that. But I'm actually choosing for myself now. And I want to feel connected to my real self. And I want to be okay with whatever is coming up for me. So, yeah, I think it's important to say. So I don't have any illusion that I'm like completely healed. Not at all. But that's also a bit of what's exciting here. Once you get started, it's like, oh, this is so exciting. What's going to happen now? Because I didn't think that life could be like this. And so every new step and every new experience and lesson is bringing something new to the table, I think. It's like I'm reimagining how to be in the present. So I want to just quote the great Greg Bogart, astrological therapist himself. I think he's like PhD and everything, so I'm not to be compared with those titles. And he's written a lot of books. And I'm just going to read to you from page 121 in Planets in Therapy. Because I think he says it so good. He says, in my counseling practice, I have found the birth chart to be a useful reference point for assessment of clients and for identifying central treatment issues. Astrological symbols can be translated into the language of the therapeutic process, revealing past or present developmental stresses, for example, childhood trauma, financial difficulty, and marital crisis, and indicating needed changes in attitudes and behaviors. In therapeutic astrology, we approach the birth chart with a growth-oriented attitude assuming that every planetary position is purposeful and has a positive potential. Can you hear what I'm underlining? Is purposeful and has a positive potential. We never want to disempower others or induce fear. We avoid reductionistic chart interpretations that will demean clients, injure their hope for self-esteem, fill them with unrealistic expectations, or diminish their sense of open possibility for growth and change. Approaching astrology with a psychological and therapeutic focus can be valuable for some of the following reasons: to identify major themes and repeated areas of emphasis in a person's life, to perceive unconscious patterns of thought, feeling, or behavior, to gain deeper self-understanding and deeper empathy for self and others, to develop an archetypal and cyclical perspective that reveals the essential meaning and purpose of events, including chaotic or painful experiences, to facilitate our ability to resolve core life dilemmas and navigate transition periods, to identify the kinds of experiences we expect during a given period of time, to help us make choices, to understand meaning and nature of crisis situations. I was a little bit fast there. You have to read the book if you want to get the words completely accurate. It was a little longer than I planned to read, but it was just because I'm still in the recap, by the way. I'm still in the recap from the last episode. So we were talking in that episode about what's even the good of mixing therapy with astrology, and I think that he just answered that. Okay, so in TAP, I did have a vision to talk about a psychological theme and then the astrological factors that might represent it. And sometimes, last time I'm not sure I nailed it. I actually don't think I completely really did nail it. And that's not gonna stop me from doing it again. I'm just here to try it out. Like what happens exactly when the words leave my mouth, I'm not sure about that. Because there is a lot with this, there is just an inside perception. So what happens when I have to communicate it? Yeah, that's where you come in. You tell me, what is it you hear? Does any of that make sense? And it's totally fine if it doesn't and you just fall asleep. I think I'll just be very honored if you'll sleep with me. I almost said. I'll not say that. But what I will say is just in general with astrology, a starting point is that it's a reading of time. And in normal day life living with repetitions and idiots who bother you in traffic, you're probably not aware that this moment in time, that every single moment in time sets a certain tone, has a certain feel to it. And in astrology, it's called synchronicity, where we make a parallel to what is happening in the sky to what is actually happening in everyday life on Earth. Because we believe this, that every single moment is filled with meaning, just like nature, that there is an inner structure in all living beings and life unfolds accordingly when the seed is ready to sprout. And the last part is really important, that it's all about maturation. If you've done some therapy work on yourself, do you know this point where you're like, oh, why didn't I see that before? I wasted 50 years of my life. And then you go into a disconnect of regret, right? I think it's really helpful to look at astrology like to understand that it was important for you to come here because you were not ready before. Pluto was not transiting your sun before. So there is this component of timing. And yeah, it aligns with the notion of an intelligent universe, basically. And astrology also is about the lived experience, and we know that charts they're only maps, right? You know this distinction between maps and territory, right? So we know that a birth chart is only a map, and we know that you have a free will. You do with your chart as you will. Now it gets interesting here, right? We're on the words on something here. Is that true? In astrology, we often say something like you're destined to your chart, but free to live it out as you will. And knowing about trauma in a broad sense, thinking about generational trauma, historical, culturally, developmentally, we know that because of that impact on you of that trauma, you're not really free before you have matured, before that's that timing component, before you have matured into agency. Because as long as you live under those constrictions, you're not really free to live your chart the way that you want to. So what is more accurate to say really is that a person is seen to have a set of potentials that wants to be realized. Can you imagine that? That you have a set of potentials inside of you that wants to be realized, and which will ripe across a lifespan. And Dane Rudra, which you probably all know, maybe, I don't know. Let me know if you know him. We call him the father of modern astrology, or psychological, humanistic astrology. A king indeed. He talked about celestial instructions on how we can unfold the lifespan. Celestial instructions. That's quite nice, right? So instead of a birth chart, we could call it celestial instructions on how we can unfold our lifespan. And it boils down to what in other traditions will be called, not a tradition that I know everything about, I've just heard the word, dharma, right? Dharma, or even something like individuation process. That there is something unique to you that needs to be realized if you're going to thrive anyway. So at its core, a chart will show an authentic way to fulfill your destiny, but the chart is also showing preferences, biases, and working with the chart will bring awareness to predispositions, really. Predispositions understood to be, it is this human mind, it's this mental lens. It's through that we experience either suffering or well-being. That's how it arises in our life. It's through that human mind, right? So in a chart, there's a high and there's a low road to take. And it depends on your level of, we can call it self-compassion. You could call it your inner development. And all of that depends on what kind of help you have met in your life. So if you come as a client and you have this inner feeling of badness or being wrong, then you probably consider yourself to be the problem that needs to be solved or fixed. And this can, again, then affect the therapist that really wants to help, because that's why the therapist is there, is like really empathetic, really wanting to help. So the therapist will maybe try to solve you, fix you, because if you're the problem, then let's solve it. And that's just not, because then that again is, it might feel nice at first because you're validated that something is wrong with you and we can try and fix it, but then actually that's the identification with something that's not truthful that's being validated. So that's why not all therapy is really helpful. I just want to put that out there. It might just support the understanding you already had of yourself. Whereas I belong to the sort of therapies that cares for the client's inner world, and it is critical to attune also somatically to whoever we are trying to help. so that the level of contact is high quality, and it's not just listening to what the client is actually saying. Remember my little anecdote in the beginning? Like what I was actually saying, okay, how can I help this client to save the world? Maybe I should look at her baby who she's not talking about at all, right? So I think it's super important, and even more with dissociation, where there really is a need to feel safe, because dissociation was an instinctual response to something threatening. And that instinctual response has just become a habit, maybe, just whatever you consider yourself to be or to be able to be. So let's go a little bit deeper into dissociation now. John Bowlby, as you probably know, has 3 stages of when there is an early separation from the mother. There's the protest due to the wish for reuniting with the mother. So the child, the baby will protest. Then there's a despair. And then there's the last one, which is detachment or dissociation, when the mother figure is not restored. And so at a certain level of deprivation, the child withdraws emotionally, and it creates a permanent incapacity for emotional relatedness. Wow, right? Whoa. Yeah, so, but let's backtrack a bit. Let's normalize dissociation, because it's also a healthy capacity to use in some other contexts than what is a traumatic adaptation. It's when we don't like pain. Okay, we don't like pain, so we try not to feel it. Maybe in a easier end, it's like we are bored. And when we are bored, our minds wander off into a trance state. It becomes an escape, a pause from reality, even feelings of being paralyzed from taking any actions. So I think that throughout a day you can recognize this state if you're being really mindful. Maybe you felt when you've been working that, oh, I've just been in my head for hours. When you wake up during a meeting, like, oh, I was supposed to listen, but didn't catch anything at all. So it's about degrees, right? Because that's not really a problem. Maybe you want to listen and then you can change it, but it's not really like a problematic dissociation, I'd say, right? Normally, it's a really a matter of degrees, and this function of dissociation, it has been supportive in the past, and it can also be supportive now. So, but let's try to spend more time on talking about the kind of dissociation that's actually a problem. We were not able to carry these emotions when we were small, and that's why this sort of freeze response to trauma came in as a last resort, as a protection. This was a survival tool for a helpless child, whereas instead of defending myself, defending your real self, it withdraws. And how many consequences that has. Think about it. Just shutting down your aliveness. Leaving your body to it, you could say. I'm just going to leave you to it. And my aliveness, out the window, wherever. So I find it interesting because, like I mentioned before, I did grow up dissociated. I mean, completely dissociated. I mean, I had no sense of my body, nor did I want to, because I was told that it was very sinful. And I would have like startle responses, out of proportion startle responses to loud noises. And I would shrink at bright lights, just normal lights, but to me it was too bright. My attention was divided up, to say the least, all through my school years, and I was highly suggestible and could not stand up for myself. And that creates internal pressure. Because, like binding the energy not to feel those emotions. And this is absolutely unconscious. Like I had no idea about these categories, obviously. You wouldn't as a child. And even as an adult, I should maybe talk about that later, but I did start on a trauma education that I did not finish at first, because I would try and I would try and I would try, this kind of logic that they would tell me something similar to what we've said here, and like feel it in your body, like feel it. And I cannot feel my body. I would say, I feel hungry. Can we go to lunch now? Okay. So I could not connect to it in the way that the other people could. And that's really one way of dissociating. It can also be that there's a part of you who's doing something and the other part is almost not recognizing that. It's like, it's really hard to own that part of yourself. So it does take a therapeutic process to be able to bear what has happened and then to recognize that it already did happen. You don't have to be afraid anymore, and not only understand these things intellectual insights. I love it, but it's not enough to really change the deep-seated patterns that blocks, that hinders your aliveness and wholeness and embodiment, which is really the opposite of dissociation. Wholeness, what I talk about, a place to find whole, a place to call home, whole. It's a play of words, right? Because it's a place to call home, and then I say a place to call whole. I just have to remember that is that's my tagline. So dissociation is an adaptation to trauma by fragmenting. Okay. So it's early trauma, and it might be a chronic state that you're in. That's certainly what I've experienced, a chronic state of dissociation, of fragmentation, where it does not feel safe to live in the body. And it's like second nature. You just don't do that. So it's the opposite of being unified into a whole, being cohesive, being integrated into a stable sense of self, where we know what happened in our life story, history, and we own what is ours. We own our thoughts about it. We own our behaviors. Being dissociated is the failure of that cohesiveness, of that togetherness. So one part owns the story and another part does not. So as dissociated, I have parts that do not want to connect to each other. And I love talking about different parts or sides to us, because that's so visible in the chart as well. But of course, it's really important with that therapeutic process, if there are parts who's like really having a hard time saying hi to each other, like where you would show up as a client and you would say, no, I don't do this, I don't want this. And then the therapist will be like, but then why did you do it? But I don't know. Because these parts are doing something in the background that you have disconnected to the meaning of that, to the relationship with those parts. So again, dissociation develops when there were experiences that were too threatening for a person to integrate fully. And if that threat is chronic and dissociation turns into a survival strategy, then you can walk around your everyday life without the overwhelm of stressful emotions. That's good, right? Yay. I don't feel it. Wonderful. But it really creates an internal division where parts of you take action and the other parts are identified with something that you're disowning. They're disowning the actions that you're taking. Yeah. I'm even getting confused now. So why did I do that thing again? And then when you ask that, and you've already, just by asking that, you might feel estranged from yourself, alienated from yourself. So the healing is really in connecting parts. Yeah. Okay, some symptoms I thought to just mention. Not feeling the body internally. Just a comment. I'm gonna mention it all, but just a comment. Internally, what I mean by that is just that usually if someone hits you with a bat, you're gonna feel it, right? So I thought that because when I fell, when I hurt myself, I felt my body. So yeah, I feel my body, but that's actually not what we're talking about in terms of dissociation, because then that would be some kind of out of body experience differently, I think, if you were not able to feel anything physically. But I mean, but internally is also physically, so it is a little bit different. But so it is a little bit the same. But yeah, just it's not when someone hits you with a bat I'm talking about. It's more when you sit still. Can you then sense your body internally? Yeah. Okay. Addiction is a big one, both because of the numbing out and because if you imagine that, let's say you're all empty, you're not, but let's say that you've considered yourself to be all empty, then there's room for things to overtake you. That's how I see it anyway. Not being able to identify emotions because of avoiding the trauma means you have to detach emotionally. Daydream, fantasy, blanking out, also a way of detaching, or even a way of numbing out. Could also be food abuse, or some kind of eating disorder, something that keeps you caught up in something you're not, and in an addiction or in a identification with something. Yeah. Losses of memory, where you can suspect that something has happened, but you don't have any recollection that it actually did. Another symptom is judging and alienating parts of yourself. Feeling a false sense of self, even, or feeling a false sub-parts of you don't want to own. For example, I'll give you this example, and I'm absolutely gonna make a chapter on it when I'm ready. Let's say theoretically, right, that you have a part that's really, really needy. That's really needy and demanding and just wants love and response and confirmation or whatever now, right this moment. And then when you sit and talk about it, it's like, oh yeah, I have this part, right? But yeah, that what I'm doing right now. So there can be parts of us that somehow is like, oh, that's really sore, right? So it's hard to actually really acknowledge them, which is part of the cure, which is part of the self-acceptance cure that we all need to take. Okay, 2 more here. I'm not very good at listing up. I want to comment on everything. That's why I made my own podcast. Okay, so complying to whatever other people want is a dissociation, potentially. And also talking in incomplete sentences. When I read that, I mean, I just read it online somewhere, but that was like really, yeah, I think I do that sometimes. And it's just fun too, maybe when you catch yourself doing that. I remember at a trauma training where we did an exercise, some of us, and there was all of a sudden I was like speaking. I was in the client's seat at that exercise. I was speaking, and then I stopped. I was like, "Oh, sorry, what was the question again?" And that's, I think that is what they mean about incomplete sentences. It's like, I was talking about something, but then I stopped myself. What's that about? Now, is there something in the background stopping me? Is there something that I'm not owning? Is there something that is threatening? Why did I stop? Right? Yeah, there are numerous consequences that will show up in a life when you are not basically in touch with yourself. That's it. You're not connected with yourself. It looks different ways, and it has different causes to it. But I know that for me, I've really had to grieve this, and it'll still come up, that I've missed a part of my life. I mean, it's just from one perspective, but there are emotions of grief there, because from another perspective, it's not actually something that I missed. But let's leave that. But because I think it is important to let yourself be with the sad feelings and the grieving of leaving yourself like that, because then going through those emotions, then there's even more space for you to land in yourself. And for me, the grieving has been actually a lot of what I had learned to do to myself. So all of what we've said and how it would show up is, let's say, we mentioned sexuality in, I think, the first one. So in sexual situations, in intimate situations, I mean, I would easily, be in touch with the physical functions. Like I needed to, like everyone. I think there's a time and a place for getting an orgasm, all of that. But even more subtle then would be, do you want to, or do you not want to? Do you feel like doing this with this person or not? And I would not really be in doubt afterwards, but before, yes. So that's one of the situations where when you've jumped out of yourself, it's really hard to come in and feel like, is this something I want? It's just, for me, it was just like, sure. yeah. Of course, like could do everyone. And that's a dissociation. And I feel it is related to Neptune. I'm gonna touch on that. But either Neptune or actually, Mercury, Uranus, because it's you got the mental dissociation, and just in your head. I'm just in head. I can't feel my body, and then also the spiritual bypassing, spiritual dissociation, because then there's this idea that we're all one, and it's bypassed to integrate that into the body. So a lot of consequences when you live your life like this. And I'm curious to hear if, as we speak about this, do you remember anything? Is there anything that comes up for you where you were like, oh, I wish that I really had been in my body? And I'm not saying this to make you regret or anything, but it's good to notice, oh yeah, this is actually what I wanted for myself, and it didn't happen. So maybe there's some sadness there that needs to be dealt with. And then once you're through that, then you can also move forward to the appreciation now that you are actually able to do these things for yourself now, that you are actually able to say yes and say no. And if you're not, then you are more able than some years ago. So I apologize for if you hear my blocked nose of mucus. This is one of the symptoms I was talking about. I'm doing this podcast because I feel I'm never gonna get over this virus, and it's been, I think, 3 months or something now, but I still can't blow my nose. I can't get it out. So this is a podcast is really not very optimal for these symptoms. But yeah, thank you for hanging in, and just wanted to explain why it sounds like this. Anyways, just wanted to get that in there, that it's possibility that there needs to be grieving before. Maybe sometimes it's a parallel process, right? But maybe there needs to be some grieving and deepening of those. Oh, I actually did leave myself. That's not good on me. I'm sad that that had to happen. You can even put it like that. So there's no blame in this, but just like feeling that grieving that needs to happen. Maybe it needs to happen, and then that's also gonna help you with the next steps, which is about, or again, parallel steps perhaps, which is about befriending yourself, which is about coming more alive within yourself. And that's maybe that's a big word, but it's gonna happen. It has happened for you, I'm sure, if you have experienced this gradually, and just realizing things about yourself. I can also be this. I can also all of that. For me, there was a big turnaround when I got into yoga. That's a crazy story. I'll do it another time. But and it didn't immediately like, oh, now I'm embodied. It doesn't work like that. I think for me, it's still a process, of course, because so many years I've been outside my body. So it's not like, oh, I'm just meeting this, I'm reading this book, I'm doing this exercise, and now I got it. I don't believe so. And I think the only people who believe so are the ones who are trying to sell you something, and they have to believe it because otherwise they can't earn any money. I don't know, but that's not the truth. That's not how it works from my perspective. Things take time, healing take time, and it happens gradually. And again, this is why it is so interesting to be alive, because then a new phase of life, even more is going to be revealed, right? And of course, then sometimes you can fall into the old emotions of, but why didn't I just get all of this from the beginning? Why did it have to be like this for me? All of that. And then you deal with that compassionately. And again, looking at the chart, there's a whole meaning to it. That's why I feel a little bit awkward saying, oh, I've missed so much, because from another perspective, it's like, no, this is actually what needed to happen in order for you to come right here, so you didn't miss anything. This was the route for you all along, right? So you have to remember that. But still, there can be these emotions of reuniting with yourself. It also needs to maybe tap into what you have lost, because you did lose something. Even if it was meant to be, even if it was a huge part of your destiny and your learning process while here on Earth. So yeah, it's a process of reconnecting with yourself, a process of learning to trust yourself again, finding what a boundary is, and figuring out, well, basically who you are. So there are many ways to go with this theme, as you see. It is really a matter of degree, and I feel it's really hard to narrow it in. But if you have the tendency, I think that you may know it by now. So I wanted to mention also a few astrological clues that someone could go to for dissociation, like, okay, is this my tendency? How will that show up in the chart? And I've thought really long and hard about it. And I'm not too sure that there is any one specific clue in the chart. Let me just expand on that. I mean, again, online somewhere, I read you can even Google it, astrology dissociation. I think that's what I Googled, and then it was in some forum. The moon and Uranus. And I quite like that, because, and by the way, for me, moon-Uranus conjunction or opposition, the square, it's the same as the moon in Aquarius or the moon in the 11th house. Not all astrologers feel like this, but I do, and it's because I come from the school of Maurice Fernandez, who's doing it like that. But when we have the moon and Uranus, that's really such I like that picture of it, but because we have our attachment, the moon, the attachment, the deepest root to our feeling system. feelings of belonging. And then together with the risk of objectifying to a point of detachment, Uranus. So the moon Uranus, I do like that. And I also have that in my chart, by the way. And it, you know, it plays out numerous ways. Just because I say, oh, I have it, doesn't mean that every single possibility how it could play out, I have that. No, it doesn't work like that. So, because it's always in combination with everything else. But I do have it, and I do really recognize that. Let's say I wanted to talk deep with my parents, like today, that's not really an option. But yeah, you know, I have tried also as an adult. So even though whether we talk about it as a child or now, what will happen is, well, it's impossible, and I'm like heroically maybe attempting again. Let me try just one more time, even though I know that it's not gonna happen. You know, I could ask my father, so how was your childhood, father? Can you tell me something about it? Or I could ask my mother, do you remember? Like, I remember that you mentioned one time that your mother used to criticize you. Do you remember that? No. No, like completely closed. I'll tell you, those questions are not successful. My parents are entrenched in denial and refuse to deal with challenging memories or face the inner emotional conflicts. And it has to do, obviously, with whatever they have been through. It's always like that. It's how they were raised, their upbringing, and also what we call a Pluto generation. Whereas I'm in the Pluto generation of Scorpio, which is exactly about like going into the deep, right? So you'll experience differences in terms of Pluto generation as well. So yeah, Uranus and Moon, that's one. The first thought I had when talking about dissociation symbolized in the chart, it was going to the air symbols, because that is something we often say when you have planets in air. And just to mention them, it's Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius, right? So when you have this huge air signature, we would talk about, you know, you would retrieve to your head, to the mind, maybe a lot, because air sign, air, the element air is what is around us, and we don't see it. It's everywhere. It's moving, and it's connecting. It's traveling. It's speaking. It's learning from ideas, and specifically ideas that are outside of the person, outside myself, in order to exchange and to find this balance between me and the other. So air signs really need intellectual stimulation, and if they get caught up in intellectual simulation, they can be detached from emotions. But this is why I say that I thought of this in the beginning when I was like looking for clues. I'm like, now I'm not sure that we should put it all on air, even though it could be a tendency, because Earth can also detach from emotions because it's so rational, right? But I guess it's just, so that's from one viewpoint. You can say that Earth can be just as detached. I think the reason we sometimes correlate dissociation of being out in your head with air is because that Earth has the body component wiring you into the Earth, right? So there's that. And then I also thought of Neptune, because Neptune has, and again, it's Neptune, it's Pisces, it's the 12th house. It has to do with experiences that are not being processed, at least when, again, we have different levels of living out Neptune. But so one of them is that it's not being processed. It's this passiveness, passive flow, and letting something else overtake you as you leave. Something else comes in as you leave, or you actually, you know where to be found. So, but there is a high road to Neptune, of course, and I actually just read something. I mentioned, no, not last time, I just mentioned him in another book, Greg Bogart. It's him again, but it's in another book, another year. And it's in the book called Astrology and Meditation. Greg Bogart. And I just wanted to read not everything he says about Neptune, because it's very long, but some of it I'm going to read. So I'm reading from page 56. We feel the intervention of a guiding intelligence that actively seeks to illuminate our paths and to make us whole. Some call this the guru, or the spirit of guidance. Jung called this the self, the archetype of wholeness. There is something inside of us that actively assists in unfolding the wholeness of what we are in our essence, in our archetypal and spiritual core, which is what the birth chart as a whole depicts. So again, this is what I find so interesting with astrology, that we have this archetype of Neptune where you can actually really be lost and you can really be addicted to something, and you don't process your feelings, and you're passive, and you're letting go too much. And then you have the higher road, which is the highest form of spirituality, where you also have to surrender, but where you surrender in a very aware way, and where you let yourself be guided by your higher self, almost by, again, I think you could call it the individuation process, because it has to do with your real self. Yeah, and then it really does relate to suicide also, but I decided that I wanted to do suicide. No, I don't want to do suicide. Don't do suicide. But I wanted to talk about suicide in a separate chapter, because I think it deserves it. It is so close to my heart. And of course, I'm talking about prevention of suicide. And I'm also talking about speaking about wanting to not live anymore. That's really important that we are able. I think this era of not speaking about it should be over. Can we just stop that era right now? Let's that be the end of that, and let's just talk about what it is that happens, even when it makes us ultimately uncomfortable, because we have to face that we might lose someone if that was what they chose, right? So anyway, that is, I just wanted to say that I wanted to reserve that. I want to reserve that for another chapter. But it is related to dissociation, of course, because dissociation is a form of not being in order to protect ourselves, really, but it makes us not alive, really, and that's why the opposite is wholeness, and it is the love of being. Can you see that? So there's the fear of being, so you're in this not feeling not connected state, and then there's the love of being, there's the presence, there's the wholeness. So thank you so much for listening. I don't have a fantastic conclusion. Just want to say that we can be aware of when we realize that we might dissociate as a pattern that blocks us from something that we want, that we may alienate ourselves or jump out of ourselves almost, then to bring that presence to it. Oh, like presence to the pattern, presence to the realizations, presence to right now. Keep coming back every time that you've left, then keep coming back. And you know what? Chap's gonna come back again, and we're gonna circle more around this topic for sure. And I'd love to hear from you on an email. And if you can't find my email, I'm never gonna know, because you're not gonna be able to text me.